Hello, welcome to Return to Life. Today, we will listen to a story about the cracks in life where people have felt weak, full of doubt, yet kept moving forward. If you are standing between exhaustion and hope, this story may be for you.
Daniel didn't notice when it started. There was no moment that stood out. No sharp pain, no sudden reaction, nothing that would make him stop and think this matters. It was just a small spot on his forehead, slightly raised, slightly rough. The kind of thing most people would ignore without a second thought. But Daniel didn't ignore it. Not because it bothered him that much. Not because it hurt. Because it didn't. That was the part that made everything easier. At first, it was just something his fingers found. While driving, his hand would drift up, almost automatically, brushing across his forehead as he focused on the road. While working, staring at a screen for too long, his fingers would trace over the same spot without him even realizing it. And at night, half watching television, his attention split between the screen and his thoughts, his hand would return again, pressing lightly, feeling for the edge of something that didn't quite belong. A small patch of skin. A slight irregularity. Nothing serious. The first time he really paid attention to it, he was standing in front of the bathroom mirror. It was early, the kind of morning where everything feels slower, quieter, not fully awake yet. He leaned in slightly, tilting his head just enough to catch the light. There it was, a small mark near the center of his forehead, faint, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He raised his hand, pressed it gently. There was a faint sensation, not pain, just awareness. His thumb moved across it, testing the surface, feeling the texture. There was a thin layer there, something dry, something fragile. His nail caught the edge without hesitation. A small lift. A slight resistance. Then it gave. A soft pull. And just like that it came off. He paused, staring at the tiny piece of skin on his fingertip for a second longer than necessary. Then his eyes shifted back to the mirror, to the spot it had left behind. A thin layer of red. Slightly wet. Not deep. Not serious. He wiped it with his finger, almost instinctively, clearing it away. It didn't hurt. That was what made it easy to do again. A few minutes later, as he moved through the rest of his morning, his hand went back. Not because he needed to, but because it was there, because something about it felt unfinished, because his brain had already registered it as something to fix. He pressed it again, lightly at first, then a little more, testing it, feeling for that same edge, that same thin layer beginning to form again. And when he found it, he didn't hesitate. Just one more time. That was how it started. Not with pain. Not with panic. Just a small habit, repeating itself. Over the next few days, that movement became part of him. In the car, his fingers would drift upward without permission. At his desk, while reading emails he barely remembered afterward, his hand would find the same exact spot. And at night, sitting on the couch, his attention fading in and out, his fingers would press, scratch, and trace the same area over and over again. Sometimes, he didn't even realize he was doing it until it was already open again. It would dry. Then he would open it. Again and again. Like he was resetting something. Like the surface wasn't allowed to finish what it started. At some point, the color changed. He noticed it, but not enough to stop. A little darker. A little deeper. Still easy to explain. Still easy to ignore. Even when it started to feel different. Not worse. Just different. One morning, standing in front of the mirror again, he leaned closer than usual. The lighting was harsher this time, brighter, less forgiving. The spot didn't look the same. The edges weren't clean anymore. The center looked darker than it should. He lifted his hand, pressed it, waiting. There should have been something. A sting. A small, sharp signal. Something that told him stop. But it didn't come. There was no pain. No sharpness. No warning. Just pressure. Flat. Dull. Wrong. He paused. His fingers stayed there longer than usual. Pressing. Waiting. trying to understand why it felt less, not more. He pressed harder. Still nothing. The skin didn't react the way it was supposed to. It didn't resist. It didn't push back. It just stayed there. Silent. Unresponsive. That was the first moment something didn't make sense. But he didn't stop. Because by then, it wasn't really a decision anymore. It was a habit. And habits don't ask questions. They repeat. Daniel wasn't the kind of person people worried about. From the outside, his life looked steady, predictable in a way that most would describe as comfortable. He was 32, working a mid-level office job that didn't excite him but didn't stress him out enough to complain about either. He paid his bills on time, kept his apartment clean, showed up when he was supposed to. Nothing extreme, nothing unstable. Just routine. And over time, that routine became the shape of his days. He woke up at roughly the same time every morning, not because he was disciplined, but because his body had learned the pattern. The alarm would go off, he'd let it ring once or twice, then reach over and silence it without fully opening his eyes. A few seconds later, he'd sit up slowly, already thinking about the day ahead, not with urgency, but with a quiet kind of acceptance. Coffee came next. Always coffee. Strong, simple, no variation. Daniel wasn't someone who liked to change things once they worked. If something felt good enough, he kept it that way. Same breakfast, same route to work, same playlist playing softly in the background as he drove. At work, he was reliable. Not exceptional. Not struggling. Just consistent. The kind of employee managers didn't have to think about too much. He answered emails, met deadlines, handled tasks without needing reminders. Most of his day was spent in front of a screen, spreadsheets, reports, messages that blurred together after a while. Hours would pass without much movement, his posture barely shifting, his eyes fixed on information that rarely stayed in his memory long enough to matter. And that was where the small habits lived. They didn't show up when he was fully engaged, not when something demanded his attention. They appeared in the gaps, those quiet moments when his mind drifted just slightly, when his focus loosened enough for his body to do something on its own. His fingers would start moving, sometimes tapping lightly against the desk, sometimes rubbing the side of his thumb, and sometimes without him even realizing it, his hand would rise to his face. It wasn't deliberate. That was the important part. He didn't sit there thinking, I'm going to touch my face now. It just happened. A natural extension of thought, like breathing, like shifting in your seat. His fingers would brush across his forehead, pause for a second, then move away again as if nothing had happened. Most of the time, he didn't even remember doing it. Stress, for Daniel, didn't look dramatic. He wasn't the kind of person who raised his voice or panicked under pressure. It built quietly instead. A slow accumulation of small things, deadlines stacking up, messages waiting for replies, the constant need to stay on top of everything without ever feeling like he was getting ahead. None of it felt overwhelming on its own. But together, over time, it created a kind of low, constant tension. And that tension had to go somewhere. For some people, it shows up in words. For others, in habits. Daniel's version was subtle. Nail-biting. Occasionally. Running his fingers along rough patches of skin. Pressing at small imperfections until they smoothed out, or until they became something else entirely. It wasn't about hurting himself. It was about fixing something. Even if that something was barely there. Even if it didn't need to be fixed at all. That was the pattern. See something slightly off. Touch it. Adjust it. Make it feel right. And then move on. But sometimes, he didn't move on. Sometimes his fingers stayed a little longer. His girlfriend noticed it before he did. She had a way of catching small details, things most people would overlook. They had been together for a little over a year, long enough to be comfortable, but not long enough to stop paying attention to each other completely. She would sit next to him in the evenings, watching him half focus on the television, his hand drifting up toward his face without him realizing it. Hey, she'd say gently, reaching over and nudging his hand away. You're doing it again. Daniel would blink, glance down, almost surprised. Oh, he'd respond. I didn't even notice. And for a moment, He would stop. His hand would drop back to his lap. His attention would return. But not for long. Because a few minutes later, it would happen again. Not because he chose to. Because his mind slipped just enough. "You should try not to touch your face so much," she said once, her tone light, not critical. "It's not great for your skin." Daniel gave a small, easy nod. "Yeah, I know." And he did know. In the same way people know a lot of small things they don't actually change. It wasn't important enough. It wasn't urgent. It was just a habit. The kind that blends into everything else until you stop seeing it altogether. Evenings were the worst for it. After work, Daniel would head home, usually taking the same route without thinking much about it. Dinner was simple, sometimes takeout, sometimes something quick he could throw together without effort. Then the couch, the television on, though not always watched. His phone in his hand, scrolling without purpose. This was where his attention fragmented the most. Part of him watching. Part of him thinking. Part of him somewhere else entirely. And in those moments, his hands were the most active. They searched, pressed, traced over small details his eyes barely registered. If there was a dry patch of skin, he found it. If there was something uneven, he noticed it. And if something didn't feel smooth, he fixed it. Or tried to. That need wasn't strong. It wasn't obsessive. It was quiet, subtle, easy to ignore. But it was always there, waiting for just enough space to take over. That was why nothing about the trip felt risky when it was suggested. A weekend away. Out of the city. Away from screens, deadlines, routines. One of his friends had brought it up casually, a camping trip. Nothing intense. Just a short drive out, a trail, a couple of nights under the trees. Daniel didn't hesitate. It sounded simple. Refreshing. Even. A break from everything that felt repetitive. His girlfriend liked the idea too. Fresh air. Open space. Something different. They planned it without overthinking. A small group. Tents. Basic supplies. Nothing complicated. Nothing extreme. Just enough to feel like an escape. And that was exactly what it was. An interruption. A pause in the pattern. At least that's what it seemed like. Because what Daniel didn't realize was that the habits he carried with him didn't stay behind when he left. They came with him. Quietly. Unnoticed. Waiting for the same kind of moments they always needed. A lapse in attention. A small imperfection. A reason to reach up and touch. Daniel didn't think about work on the drive out. That was the first thing he noticed. Not in a dramatic way. Not like something had suddenly lifted. But gradually, mile by mile, the usual background noise in his head began to fade. The emails he hadn't answered, the small tasks waiting for him on Monday, the quiet pressure that normally sat just beneath his thoughts. It all softened. The road stretched out ahead of him, long and open, lined with trees that grew thicker the farther they got from the city. His girlfriend sat beside him, scrolling through something on her phone, occasionally glancing up to point out something outside a lake in the distance, a narrow side road. The way the light shifted as they passed through patches of shade. "You feel that?" she asked at one point, rolling the window down slightly. Daniel glanced over. "What?" "Just the air," she said, smiling a little. "It's different out here." He nodded, letting the breeze drift in. It was cooler, cleaner, in a way that was hard to describe. Less processed, less contained. "Yeah," he said. "It is." And for a while, that was enough. By the time they reached the campsite, the sun was lower in the sky, filtering through tall trees in long, uneven beams. The ground was covered in dry leaves and patches of dirt, the air carrying that quiet mix of earth and wood, and something faintly damp underneath it all. Their friends were already there, setting up tents, moving around with that loose, unhurried energy people have when they're not watching the clock. "About time," one of them called out as Daniel stepped out of the car. "Traffic," Daniel replied automatically, though it hadn't really been that bad. They settled in quickly. Tents went up. Bags were unpacked. Someone started organizing food. Someone else gathered small pieces of wood for a fire later. The rhythm of it all felt simple, almost instinctive. No screens, no deadlines, just small, physical tasks that ended when they were done. For the first time in a while, Daniel felt present. Not fully aware of everything, but grounded enough that his thoughts didn't drift as far. That didn't mean they stopped drifting entirely. It just meant the moments where they slipped were quieter, easier to miss. The trail they chose the next day wasn't difficult. A narrow path cutting through thicker parts of the forest, winding slightly as it moved between trees that grew closer together the deeper they went. Sunlight filtered through unevenly, breaking into thin lines that shifted as the branches above moved with the wind. The air felt heavier there, cooler, but denser. There were sounds everywhere, leaves shifting underfoot, distant birds, insects moving through the undergrowth, but none of it felt intrusive. It blended together into something constant, something easy to ignore after a while. They walked in a loose group, talking without urgency, the conversation moving in and out of focus the same way Daniel's attention did. At one point, his girlfriend stepped slightly ahead, turning back toward him as she said something he didn't fully catch. "What?" he asked. "I said it's nice out here," she repeated, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, it is." And it was. There was something about being away from everything predictable that made even small things feel different. The way the ground shifted under his feet, the way the air moved against his skin, the way time felt less structured, less divided into tasks and expectations. But the forest wasn't empty. It only felt that way if you weren't paying attention to the smaller things. And most people weren't. Somewhere along the trail, as they passed through a slightly denser stretch, where low branches brushed closer to their shoulders and faces, it happened. A quick sensation. Sharp, but brief. Right at his forehead. Just above his eyebrow. Daniel's hand came up immediately, almost reflexively, brushing across the spot as if clearing something away. It was automatic. He didn't stop walking. Didn't even slow down. "You good?" his girlfriend asked, noticing the movement. "Yeah," he said, already dropping his hand. "Just something hit me." "Bug?" she asked. "Probably," he replied with a small shrug. And that was it. No pause. No inspection. No second thought. If he had looked, he might have seen something. A tiny mark. Slightly raised. Barely visible. But he didn't. Because there was no reason to. Nothing about it felt important enough to interrupt the moment. The conversation continued. Someone up ahead pointed out something on the trail. Another voice responded. The group kept moving, the rhythm unbroken. And within seconds, Daniel had already forgotten about it. That was the part that mattered most. Not the bite itself. Not the sensation. But how quickly it disappeared from his awareness. Because nothing about it demanded to be remembered. It didn't hurt. It didn't linger. It didn't signal anything beyond what he already expected. Just another small interaction with the environment. Something normal. Something harmless. They kept walking for another 20 minutes before turning back. By then, whatever had happened was already behind them, not just physically, but mentally. The campsite came back into view gradually, the familiar shapes of tents and scattered gear appearing between the trees. The atmosphere shifted again. Voices grew louder. Laughter picked up. Someone started talking about food. Another suggested starting a fire before it got dark. The focus moved back to comfort. Back to routine. Even in a different setting. Daniel stretched slightly as they stepped back into the open space, rolling his shoulders, adjusting to the change in light. For a brief moment, his hand lifted again. Not consciously. Just a small movement, his fingers brushing across his forehead as if checking something he couldn't quite name. He paused. Barely. There was something there. Not pain. Just a faint awareness. A slight unevenness under his skin. He pressed it lightly. Then, a little more. Testing it. The way people do when something feels new, but not concerning. Probably just a bite, he muttered under his breath. His girlfriend glanced over. What? Nothing, he said quickly, lowering his hand. Just a bug or something. She looked at him for a second, then nodded. already turning her attention back to the others. And just like that, it was dismissed. Labeled. Placed into a category that didn't require attention. That didn't require action. That didn't require concern. A bite. Something small. Something temporary. Something the body would handle on its own. That assumption settled in quietly. And once it did, everything else followed it. The rest of the evening passed without anything unusual. They built a fire as the light faded, the air cooling just enough to notice. The forest shifted again as night approached, the sounds changing, deepening, becoming less familiar. Daniel sat with the others, listening more than he spoke, watching the movement of the flames, the way shadows stretched and shifted across the ground. For a while, his hands stayed still, resting, occupied. But as the night went on, as the conversation slowed and his attention drifted just slightly, his fingers moved again, upward, toward his forehead. They found the spot without searching. They always did. He pressed it lightly. There it was again. That same small irregularity. Slightly raised now. More noticeable than before. He scratched it once. Gently. Then again. A little more deliberately. The sensation responded immediately. A faint itch. Subtle, but enough. Enough to draw him back. He stopped for a moment, pulling his hand away, as if reminding himself not to overdo it. But the feeling didn't disappear. It lingered. Quiet. Persistent. Waiting. A few minutes passed. Then, his hand returned. This time, slower. More focused. His nail traced the surface, searching for the edge of something just beginning to form. And when he found it, he paused. Just for a second. Then, he pulled. A thin layer lifted slightly. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to change the surface. Enough to start something. He exhaled softly, almost unconsciously, as if releasing a small tension he hadn't realized was there. Relief. Small. Temporary. But real. And that was all it needed to be. Because the brain doesn't need a strong reward to learn something. It just needs a consistent one. That was the moment the pattern began to connect. The bite. The sensation. The touch. The response. Not consciously. Not in a way he could explain. But physically. The location. The feeling. The instinct to go back to it again. A bite became an itch. An itch became something to fix. And something to fix became something to repeat. By the time Daniel went to sleep that night, the spot on his forehead had already changed slightly. Still small. Still easy to ignore. But no longer nothing. And beneath the surface, far below anything he could see or feel, something had already begun to move. Slowly. Silently. Without pain. Without warning. Without asking for attention. He didn't know it then. But something had already entered his skin. The next morning, Daniel didn't think about the bite. Not right away. It wasn't the first thing on his mind when he woke up. It wasn't urgent. It didn't hurt. It didn't interrupt anything. It just existed somewhere in the background, quiet and unimportant, waiting for the moment his attention drifted just enough to notice it again. That moment came in front of the mirror. He leaned in slightly, still half asleep, his eyes adjusting to the light as he ran a hand across his face. His fingers paused at the center of his forehead, as if they had been guided there by memory rather than intention. There it was. A small, dry patch. More defined than the night before. Not large. Not alarming. Just there. He pressed it lightly. Then rubbed it once with his thumb, feeling the texture more clearly this time. The surface wasn't smooth anymore. There was a thin layer forming again, tight, slightly raised, like something trying to close. He stared at it for a second. Then, his nail caught the edge. A small movement. Almost automatic. He pulled. The layer lifted. Easier than before. There was a faint sting this time, sharper than the night before, but brief. It passed almost immediately, replaced by that same small release. That same subtle shift from tension to relief. He wiped the spot quickly with his finger, watching the thin trace of red appear, then fade as he cleaned it away. For a moment, he considered leaving it alone, just letting it close. But that thought didn't hold, because already the surface felt different. Open, unfinished. And that feeling more than anything else pulled his attention back. That was the beginning of the loop. Not the bite, not the first touch, but this, the moment his brain connected the action to the result. Touch, feel, remove relief. Small, simple, effective, and most importantly, repeatable. As the morning went on, the pattern continued. Not constantly, not in a way that would stand out, just often enough. While brushing his teeth, his fingers returned briefly, pressing the spot again as if checking it. While getting dressed, he caught himself in the mirror and touched it once more, smoothing the area like he was adjusting something that didn't sit right. Each time, the same sequence. A brief pause. A small movement. A quiet reset. By the time he left the bathroom, the surface had already been opened twice. But it didn't feel like damage. It felt like maintenance. That was the difference. Throughout the day, the behavior blended into everything else. In the car, waiting at a red light, his hand lifted without permission, his fingers brushing across his forehead, finding the exact location without searching. He pressed it lightly, then dragged his nail across the surface, testing it. There it was again. That thin layer. Not fully formed, but enough. He lifted it slightly, then let go. Not this time, but the next one. At his desk, the cycle became even more subtle. Hours passed in front of the screen, his focus narrowing and expanding in waves. Emails, numbers, small decisions that didn't require much thought. And in the spaces between them, those tiny gaps where his attention loosened, his hand moved again. Up, across, pause, press. Sometimes he didn't break the surface. Sometimes he just traced it. But every time he touched it, he reinforced something. A pathway, a pattern, a habit building itself without asking for permission. Around midday, he went to the restroom, more out of routine than necessity. As he washed his hands, his eyes lifted toward the mirror again. The spot was easier to see now. Still small, but clearer. The center, slightly darker. The edges less clean. He leaned in, studying it for a second longer than before. Then his hand moved again. This time, slower. More deliberate. His nail found the edge almost immediately. He pulled. The skin separated again. A sharper sting this time, but still manageable. Still not enough to stop him. He exhaled softly as the surface gave way. That same subtle release settling in. Relief. Again. He wiped it. Cleared it. Reset it. And just like that, the cycle completed itself. The rest of the afternoon followed the same rhythm. Dry. Open. Dry again. Open again. Each time, the interval between actions shortened slightly. Not enough to notice consciously, but enough that the pattern strengthened. Because habits don't need awareness to grow. They just need repetition. By the time he got home that evening, the spot had changed again. Not dramatically, but enough. The area around it felt slightly warmer than the rest of his skin. Not hot, not painful, just different. When his fingers brushed over it, the contrast stood out not strongly, but clearly enough to register. He paused, pressed it, held his fingers there a second longer, then released. Probably just irritated, he muttered under his breath. The explanation came easily. It fit. And when something fits, you don't question it. You accept it. And move on. His girlfriend noticed it not long after. They were sitting on the couch, the television on, though neither of them was fully watching it. Daniel's attention drifted, as it usually did in moments like this, and his hand followed. Up. To his forehead. Press. Scratch. Pause. You're doing it again, she said, gently nudging his arm. Daniel blinked, glancing down as if he had been caught mid-thought. Oh, he said. Yeah. You keep messing with that spot, she added, her tone still calm, but more focused now. He shrugged slightly. It's just itchy. It looks a little red, she said. He nodded. Yeah, I probably just irritated it. There it was again. The same explanation. Simple. Harmless. Enough. She watched him for another second, then leaned back, letting it go. Because from the outside, it didn't look like a problem. It looked like a habit, and habits rarely feel urgent. A few minutes passed. Then his hand went back. This time, slower, more controlled, almost as if he was trying to prove he had control over it. His fingers traced the edges of the spot, feeling for the same unevenness. The surface had started to tighten again. There it was. That thin layer forming. Incomplete. Waiting. His nail pressed lightly against it. Caught it. Lifted it. A pause. Then, he pulled. The skin gave way again. Easier than it should have. The sting was brief. The relief was immediate. And just like that, the loop reset. By the end of the night, the spot had gone through the cycle more times than he could have counted. Not because he was trying to, but because he wasn't trying not to. That was the difference. The absence of resistance. The absence of awareness. The absence of anything strong enough to interrupt the pattern. As he got ready for bed, standing in front of the mirror one last time, he looked at it again. It didn't look like a bite anymore. Not exactly. It had shape now. Presence. A defined area that stood out against the rest of his skin. He pressed it lightly. Then harder. Testing it. The response was still there. Still within what he considered normal. Still something he could explain. Yeah. It's nothing, he said quietly. But his hand didn't leave right away. It lingered. Pressing. Tracing. Memorizing. Because by then, he didn't need to look anymore. He knew exactly where it was. And that familiarity made it easier. Faster. Automatic. He turned off the light and stepped away, leaving the mirror behind. But the pattern didn't stay there. It followed him. Into the next day. Into the next moment. Into every gap where his attention slipped just enough for his hand to rise again. And with each repetition, the surface never had a chance to close. Each time it tried, he opened it. Again. And again. And again. And while he focused on what he could feel, something underneath continued without interruption. Because the loop wasn't just repeating on the surface anymore. It was creating space. And anything that needs space only needs time. By the next morning, the change was no longer subtle. It didn't appear all at once. There was no single moment where everything shifted from normal to alarming. It happened the same way everything else had, quietly, in small increments that didn't feel urgent enough to question. Daniel noticed it while brushing his teeth. Not because it looked dramatically worse, but because it felt different. His hand moved to his forehead again, slower this time, as if something in him was already paying closer attention. His fingers pressed lightly against the spot, then paused. The warmth was stronger now. Not just a slight difference. Something clearer. More defined. He pressed again, this time holding his fingers there, comparing it to the surrounding skin without fully realizing he was doing it. There was a boundary now. A clear edge where the sensation changed. That should have meant something. But instead, his mind did what it had been doing all along. It adjusted. Yeah, it's probably just irritated, he muttered quietly, the explanation forming almost automatically. He leaned closer to the mirror. The redness had spread. Not dramatically. Not in a way that demanded immediate concern. But enough that he could see it without looking too hard. The center looked darker than before. Not black. Not yet. Just deeper. As if the color wasn't sitting on the surface anymore, but coming from somewhere underneath. He stared at it for a second longer than usual. Then his hand moved again. Because looking at it wasn't enough. He needed to feel it. His fingers pressed into the center, gently at first. Then, slightly harder. Testing it. The response was still there. A dull sensation. Muted. But present. That was enough. Enough to keep the same explanation intact. He stepped back from the mirror. Moved on. Because it still fit the pattern. Still within what he considered normal. Still something that didn't require action. That was the problem. As the morning went on, the sensation didn't fade. It stayed. Low. Constant. Not painful. But present in a way that followed him even when he wasn't touching it. While getting dressed, his hand returned. While grabbing his keys, it returned again. Each time, shorter. Quicker. But still there. Each time reinforcing the same connection. The same loop. Touch, check, adjust, move on. Except now, it wasn't adjusting anymore. It was just interacting. The surface felt softer in the center. That was new. He noticed it while standing by the door, his fingers pressing slightly harder this time, as if confirming something. The skin didn't push back the same way. It gave. Just slightly. He frowned for a second. A small crease forming between his brows. Then, he explained it. Swelling, he said under his breath. That made sense. Swelling can feel soft. That happens all the time. So he accepted it. And moved on. Because, again, it fit. Everything still fit. By midday, the visual change had caught up with the sensation. The redness had spread further. The edges, no longer soft or even. They looked uneven, like they were pushing outward instead of fading into the surrounding skin. His girlfriend noticed it almost immediately. They were sitting outside for a moment, taking a break before heading out to grab something to eat. She turned toward him mid-conversation, then stopped. "Hey," she said. Daniel looked up. "What?" She leaned in slightly, her eyes focusing on his forehead. "That looks worse," she said. Her tone wasn't alarmed. Not yet. But it was different. More focused. Daniel glanced up instinctively, as if he could see it without a mirror. "It's just irritated," he replied quickly. "You've been messing with it a lot," she said. "Yeah," he admitted, with a small shrug. "I probably just overdid it." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes stayed on it a second longer. "It looks like it's spreading," she said. Daniel nodded, but the movement was more automatic than thoughtful. "That happens," he said. "Skin gets inflamed." The explanation came faster now. Smoother. Less hesitation. Because the more something changes, the more the brain works to keep the original story intact. She leaned back slightly, still watching him. "You should leave it alone," she said. "I will," he replied. And for a moment, he meant it. But the habit didn't care about intention. A few minutes later, his hand went back. Not aggressively. Not urgently. Just naturally. His fingers found the spot again, pressing lightly, tracing the edges, feeling the difference he had just explained away. The warmth was stronger now. More noticeable. He pressed the center again. Softer. Still. He paused. Longer this time. But not long enough. Because a second later, his nail caught the edge. There was still a thin layer forming. Not stable. Not fully healed. Just enough to remove. He hesitated. A brief flicker. Then, he pulled. The surface opened again. This time, the color underneath looked slightly darker. He noticed it. Registered it. Then wiped it away. Reset. That was still the pattern. Even now, even as everything was shifting. By the time they got home later that day, the change was harder to ignore. Not because it suddenly became severe, but because it became consistent. The warmth didn't fade. The redness didn't shrink. The softness in the center didn't go away. It stayed. Present. Persistent. He walked into the bathroom again, turning on the light, almost out of habit now. But this time, he didn't just glance. He looked. Really looked. The area had expanded. Clearly. No longer something you had to search for. The center was darker again. Deeper. The edges looked sharper. Not clean. Not smooth. Just defined in a way that felt wrong. He lifted his hand slowly. Pressed it again. The sensation responded. But weaker. Duller. As if something underneath wasn't reacting the way it should. He pressed harder. Still something. But less. That was new. He stood there for a moment. Quiet. Processing. Trying to match what he was feeling with what he believed. It's just infected, he said finally. The word came out slower this time. Less certain. But still there. Still an explanation. Still something he could manage. He reached for the sink. Turned on the water. Cleaned it. Carefully this time. More attention than before. Soap. Water. Gentle pressure. Then something stronger. Antiseptic. He applied it directly. Waited. There was a reaction. A sting. Sharper than anything he had felt so far. He tightened his jaw slightly. Held still. That's good, he said quietly. Because pain, even small pain, felt like confirmation. Like proof that something was still working. That he was fixing it. But when the sting faded, the deeper sensation didn't change. The warmth stayed. The softness stayed. The dullness stayed. Unmoved. He looked at it again. Longer this time. Then stepped back. For a brief moment, he considered stopping. Letting it heal. Not touching it again. But habits don't break in moments like that. They wait. And then, they return. A few minutes later, his hand went back. Slower. More careful. But the same. His fingers traced the surface. Found the edge. Lifted it. And pulled. Again. Because part of him still believed. It was nothing. Just skin. Just irritation. Just something small. And that belief was what allowed everything underneath to keep going. Because while he kept focusing on the surface, cleaning it, touching it, reopening it, something deeper had already begun to change. Quietly. Silently. Out of reach. By the end of the night, the area felt different in a way he couldn't ignore completely anymore. Not just warmer. Not just softer. But heavier. As if the sensation wasn't sitting on the surface anymore, but coming from somewhere below it. He pressed it one last time before bed. Waiting for that familiar response. That small signal. But it came back weaker. Fainter. Like something was fading. He pulled his hand away slowly. And for the first time, he didn't go back right away. Because something about it didn't feel the same anymore. It didn't feel like something to fix. It felt like something changing on its own. And he didn't understand it. Not yet. But the pattern was already breaking. Not because he chose to stop, but because the situation had moved past the point where the pattern made sense. By the next morning, it would become something he couldn't explain at all. The next morning didn't feel like a continuation. It felt like a shift. Not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable in a way Daniel couldn't immediately explain. He noticed it before he even opened his eyes fully. A quiet awareness sitting in the background of his body. Something that didn't match the pattern of the previous days. When he finally sat up and instinctively brought his hand to his forehead, the difference became clear not because something new had appeared, but because something had disappeared. The pain was gone. Not reduced, not lighter. Gone. Completely. His fingers pressed gently at first, as if expecting a delayed reaction, waiting for that familiar sting that had always followed. Nothing came. He pressed again, a little harder this time, his brows tightening slightly as his attention narrowed. Still nothing. No sharpness, no ache, no resistance, just pressure. Flat, empty. He froze there for a second, his fingers resting against his skin, his mind trying to catch up to what his body was telling him. This wasn't better. It didn't feel like healing. It felt like something had stopped responding. He stood up slowly and walked to the bathroom, his movements more deliberate now, as if moving too fast might make him miss something important. The light flicked on, and he looked at himself fully for the first time that morning. The change was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. The center of the wound had darkened further, no longer just deep red or purple but something closer to black, uneven in tone, as if the color was coming from beneath layers of skin instead of sitting on top. The edges around it were still red, still inflamed, but sharper now, more defined, like something pushing outward from the center. He leaned closer, his breathing slowing slightly as his focus tightened. His hand lifted again, hesitating just a fraction longer this time before touching it. He pressed directly into the center. Nothing. He pressed harder. Still, nothing. That was the moment the confusion shifted into something heavier. Not full fear yet, but something close enough that his body recognized it before his thoughts did. Because this broke the pattern. Everything up to this point had followed a logic he understood. Irritation, redness, swelling, those made sense. Even the pain made sense. But this didn't. A wound that looked worse should feel worse. That was the rule his brain expected, and this wasn't following it. He pulled his hand back slowly, staring at the spot as if waiting for it to react on its own. It didn't. It just stayed there. Still. Silent. Unresponsive. "That's weird," he said quietly, the words lacking the certainty he had relied on before. His girlfriend appeared in the doorway a moment later, drawn more by the tone of his voice than anything else. "What?" she asked, stepping closer. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just turned slightly, giving her a clear view. She leaned in, her eyes focusing on his forehead, and this time her reaction was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. She didn't speak for a second. Then, "That looks really bad." Daniel exhaled lightly, trying to steady the situation, trying to pull it back into something manageable. "It's probably just bruised or something," he said, though the words came slower now, less convincing even to himself. She didn't look away. "Does it hurt?" she asked. He shook his head. "No." That answer changed the air between them instantly. "It should hurt," she said. Daniel looked back at the mirror again, as if double-checking his own body, then pressed the spot again, harder this time, almost trying to force a response. Still nothing. The absence became louder the longer it stayed. Because pain, at least, gives you information. It tells you where the problem is. It tells you something is wrong. This gave him nothing. Just silence. And that silence was harder to ignore than anything he had felt before. "I don't feel anything," he said, more quietly now. His girlfriend's expression shifted again. The uncertainty gone now, replaced with something more direct. "You need to get that checked," she said. Daniel didn't respond immediately. His mind was still trying to adjust, still searching for a version of the situation that fit the explanations he had been using. Infection, irritation, swelling, none of those explained this. Not like this. "It might just need time," he said, but the words didn't land the same way they had before. "Time for what?" she asked. He didn't have an answer. Because deep down, something had already changed. Not just in the wound, but in his understanding of it. This wasn't getting better. It wasn't stabilizing. It had moved into something else entirely, and for the first time, he couldn't explain it away. He looked at it again. Really looked this time, not as something to fix, but as something to understand. The color, the shape, the way the center didn't respond. The way the edges looked like they were spreading. And underneath all of that, the absence. That was what finally broke through the last layer of hesitation. Not pain, not how it looked, but what it didn't feel like anymore. He reached for his phone, then stopped halfway, his eyes still locked on the mirror. For a second, he just stood there, suspended between the habit of waiting and the instinct to act. Then he lowered his hand slightly and said, "Okay." It was quiet, but it was enough. "I'll go get it checked." And even as the words left his mouth, there was a shift, not relief, not yet, but movement. A decision finally made after too many moments where it could have been made earlier. Because by the time something stops hurting, it doesn't always mean it's getting better. Sometimes, it means something underneath has already gone too far. And by the moment Daniel realized that by the moment the absence of pain finally made him stop, the situation had already moved beyond the point where it could have been simple. By the time they got to the clinic, everything felt slightly unreal. Not in a dramatic way, not like something had snapped or broken, just off. Like the normal rhythm of things had been replaced by something quieter, more controlled, where every movement seemed to matter more than it should. The waiting room was calm. Too calm. A few people sat scattered across the chairs, each absorbed in their own small world, phones, magazines, distant thoughts. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the space, steady and constant, blending with the faint sounds of movement somewhere beyond the hallway. Daniel sat down slowly, his arm resting against his leg, his eyes drifting upward again. But this time, his hand didn't follow. For the first time since it started, he didn't touch it. Not because he made a decision, but because something about it no longer invited contact. It didn't feel like something to fix anymore. It felt like something to leave alone. His girlfriend sat beside him, closer than usual, her posture slightly tense. She glanced at him once, then at his forehead, then back again, as if trying to measure whether things were getting worse just by looking. Neither of them said much. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said. When his name was called, he stood up almost immediately. No hesitation. No delay. Just movement. The hallway felt shorter than it should have. The room they entered was clean, neutral, controlled in a way that made everything else feel more real. A place where things weren't ignored. Where they were named. The doctor stepped in a moment later. Calm. Focused. Already observing before asking anything. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. Daniel hesitated for half a second, then lifted his hand slightly toward his forehead. "It started as a bug bite," he said. The words felt strange now. Too simple. Too small for what it had become. The doctor nodded once, stepping closer. "Let me take a look." There was no immediate reaction. No visible alarm. Just attention. His eyes moved slowly across the area, studying it in a way Daniel hadn't. Not just the center, but the edges. The color. The shape. The way it spread. That pause lasted longer than expected. Then the doctor reached for gloves, put them on, and leaned in. "Does this hurt?" he asked, pressing lightly near the edge. Daniel shook his head. "No." The doctor pressed again, closer to the center this time. "And this?" Daniel hesitated. "No." That was the moment something shifted. Not visibly, but clearly. The doctor straightened slightly, his expression tightening just enough to notice. "How long has it looked like this?" he asked. Daniel swallowed lightly. "A couple days, maybe less," he said. "It got worse pretty fast." The doctor nodded slowly. "And you've been touching it?" There was no accusation in the question. Just certainty. Daniel glanced down briefly. "Yeah." "How often?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Because there wasn't a clear number. It wasn't something he tracked. "It just kept happening," he said finally. The doctor nodded again, then stepped back. "We're going to need to take this seriously," he said. The tone was still calm, but there was no softness in it now. "No, let's wait and see." No uncertainty. Just direction. "What is it?" Daniel asked. The doctor paused for a second, choosing his words. "It appears to be a severe soft tissue infection," he said. "Possibly necrotizing." The word landed heavily. Unfamiliar. Uncomfortable. Daniel blinked. What does that mean?" he asked. The doctor looked at him directly. "It means the infection is not just on the surface," he said. "It's affecting the tissue beneath your skin." Daniel's eyes shifted slightly, trying to process it. "But it was just a bite," he said. The doctor nodded. "That's often how it begins." Then, after a brief pause, he added, "It didn't start when it turned dark. It started when bacteria entered through the skin. That changed everything. Because it moved the beginning back. Back to a moment Daniel had already dismissed." The doctor continued, his voice steady, precise. "When the skin is broken even slightly, it creates an entry point. Normally, your body can handle that. But when the area is repeatedly disturbed," he glanced briefly toward Daniel's forehead, then back at him. "It prevents the natural barrier from forming." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Not panic. Not yet. But recognition. Each time you reopened it, the doctor continued, you gave the bacteria another opportunity to move deeper. There it was. Not blame. Not judgment. Just cause and effect. Daniel looked away for a second, his gaze dropping toward the floor. The pattern. The repetition. The habit. None of it had felt dangerous. And yet, it had been part of what allowed this to happen. We need to act quickly, the doctor said. This time, there was no attempt to soften it. This type of infection can progress rapidly. That was the first moment the word urgent didn't need to be said. Because it was already there. In the tone, in the pace, in the way everything shifted from observation to action. Daniel nodded slowly. Okay, he said. But even as he said it, something inside him had already changed. Because this wasn't something he could manage anymore. Not something he could clean. Not something he could fix in small steps. This had moved beyond that. Beyond the surface. Beyond the point where it could be ignored. Because what he was seeing now wasn't where it began. It was just where it finally showed itself. And everything that came next moved faster than anything before it. Not chaotic. Not rushed. But precise. Focused. Controlled in a way that made it clear. There was no more time to wait. He was guided from one step to the next, each instruction following the last without pause. The room changed. The tone changed. The situation, which had felt uncertain just hours before, was now defined. This wasn't a possibility anymore. It was happening. And the part that stayed with him, the part that settled in deeper than anything else, was how ordinary it had felt at the beginning. How small. How easy to ignore. Because now, standing there, listening to words he had never expected to hear, he understood something he hadn't before. The danger hadn't started when it looked bad. It hadn't started when it stopped hurting. It had started much earlier, at a moment that didn't feel important at all. And everything after that had just been time. What followed didn't feel dramatic. There were no loud alarms, no sudden rush of chaos, no moment where everything spiraled out of control. It was quieter than that, more controlled, and in some ways, that made it heavier. Daniel was moved from one room to another, each step guided, each instruction clear. People spoke calmly, efficiently, never raising their voices, never rushing but never slowing down either. Everything had purpose. Everything had weight. He lay back as they prepared him, staring up at the ceiling again, the same way he had that morning, but now the stillness felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything he hadn't realized until now. His girlfriend stayed close. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her presence alone said enough. What are they going to do? Daniel asked quietly, his voice lower than before. She hesitated for a second. They said they need to remove the damaged tissue, she replied carefully. Remove. The word landed differently than anything else he had heard so far. Not treat. Not heal. Remove. Daniel nodded slowly. He understood. Not fully, but enough. The procedure itself blurred together in his memory. Not because it was rushed, but because his mind couldn't hold on to every detail. Bright lights. Measured voices. Hands moving with precision. At some point, the focus shifted away from what he could feel, and toward what he couldn't, because that was still the strangest part. The absence. The part of his body that no longer responded. No pain. No signal. Just silence. And that silence was what they were cutting away. Time passed. He didn't know how long. Long enough for something to change. When he opened his eyes again, everything felt slower. Softer. The sharp edge of urgency had faded, replaced by something heavier. More final. His forehead was wrapped now. Carefully. Securely. More than just a simple bandage. He didn't reach up to touch it. Not this time. He didn't need to. Because he already knew. Something was gone. Not everything. But enough. His girlfriend was still there, sitting close, her attention fixed on him the moment he moved. You're okay, she said softly. Daniel nodded once. But his eyes didn't leave the reflection in the dark screen across from him. They had to remove some of it, she added, her voice quieter now. He swallowed. I figured, he said. There was no panic in his tone. No shock. Just a slow understanding settling into place. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had happened. The small moments. The ones that didn't feel important at the time. The ones that passed without resistance. The ones that felt harmless. Daniel shifted slightly, his gaze lowering. I thought it was nothing, he said. Not really to her. More like he needed to hear it out loud. She didn't respond right away. There wasn't anything to correct. Because it had looked like nothing. I almost didn't come in, he added after a moment. That part stayed longer. Because it was true. There had been a point more than one where everything could have stopped. When it was still small. Still contained. Still something his body could handle on its own. But those moments didn't feel urgent. They didn't feel like decisions. They felt optional. And that was what made them dangerous. His eyes drifted upward again, toward where the bandage sat. He didn't touch it. He just looked. I kept messing with it, he said quietly. This time, his girlfriend looked at him. Not to interrupt. Not to reassure. Just to acknowledge it. Because now, he understood. Not just what happened, but how it happened. And how easily it could have been different. The habit. The repetition. The small action that never felt like a choice. Touching it. Opening it. Resetting it. Again. And again. And again. Each time giving something unseen exactly what it needed. Time. Access. A way deeper. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly. There was no anger in him. No frustration. Just clarity. The kind that only comes after something has already happened. After the outcome is no longer uncertain. After the cost is visible. He closed his eyes for a moment. And in that quiet space, all the small moments came back. The mirror. The first time he pulled at it. The times he told himself it was nothing. The times he could have stopped. But didn't. Not because he chose not to. Because it never felt like something that needed choosing. And that was the part that stayed with him the most. Not the pain. Not the procedure. Not even the scar that would eventually remain. But how ordinary it all felt in the beginning. How easy it was to ignore. How natural it was to repeat. He opened his eyes again. And this time, he didn't look away. Because there was nothing left to avoid. Only something to understand. Most people think danger feels obvious. They imagine it as something sharp, something loud, something that forces you to stop the moment it begins. Pain. Panic. A clear signal that something is wrong. But that's not how this started. It didn't begin when the skin turned dark. It didn't begin when the infection spread. And it definitely didn't begin in the hospital. It began earlier. In a moment that didn't feel important. A small bite. A quick reaction. Something easy to dismiss. And then, something even smaller. A habit. A quiet, repetitive motion that didn't ask for attention. Touching. Pressing. Picking. Just enough to feel something. Just enough to fix what didn't feel smooth. Just enough to think. It's nothing. That's the part most people don't notice. Because the action itself doesn't feel dangerous. It feels controlled. It feels familiar. It feels like something you can stop anytime you want. But it's not about control. It's about repetition. The brain doesn't need a strong reason to continue something. It just needs a consistent one. A small sensation. A small relief. A small reward. Enough to bring you back. Again. And again. And again. Until the action stops feeling like a choice. And starts feeling like a pattern. Daniel didn't think the risk was what he was doing. The touching. The picking. The way his fingers kept returning to the same spot on his forehead. But that wasn't where the danger began. The danger began the moment something entered his skin. And he gave it time. He gave it access. He gave it a way to keep going. Not all at once. Not intentionally. But repeatedly. Every time the surface started to close, he opened it again. Every time his body tried to protect itself, he reset the process. And, because it didn't hurt, because nothing forced him to stop, there was nothing to interrupt the pattern. That's what made it dangerous. Not the intensity, but the absence. The absence of pain. The absence of urgency. The absence of anything that felt serious enough to act on. People wait for a warning. They wait for something obvious. Something that demands attention. But not everything works that way. Some things move quietly. They spread without being felt. They change before you realize anything has changed at all. And by the time there's a clear signal, it's already been there longer than you think. Long enough to matter. Long enough to grow. Long enough to become something else entirely. Daniel thought the danger started when he couldn't feel it anymore. When the center of the wound stopped responding. When the pain disappeared. But by that point, it wasn't the beginning. It was already the result. Because sometimes, the most dangerous moment isn't when something hurts. It's when it stops hurting. And you think that means it's getting better. So the next time your hand finds something small, a rough patch of skin, a healing cut, a spot that feels just slightly off, pay attention. Not because it's already serious, but because it might not feel serious at all. And that's exactly how it begins. Daniel thought it was just a small spot on his forehead. Just something to fix. Just something to smooth out. Just one more time. But it was never just one more time. And it was never just the surface. Because sometimes, the real damage isn't what you see. It's what you keep reopening. Until it finally has time to become something you can't ignore anymore.
Thank you for staying until the end with Return to Life. If you found a sense of connection or a small spark of hope, carry it with you as you return to everyday life. We look forward to seeing you in the stories ahead.